Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we discuss a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is February 7th. On this day in 1968, a horrifying crime rocked the quiet town of Bromley, England. Claire Josephs, a young woman in the prime of her life, was brutally murdered in her own home. But this case is about more than just a tragedy. It also marked a major milestone in forensic science. Thanks to the meticulous work of investigators and forensic experts, the man responsible for her death was brought to justice using evidence that at the time was groundbreaking. So today we're going to be diving into Claire's story, who she was, what happened that terrible night, and how forensic science helped secure a conviction in a case that might have otherwise gone unsolved. Let's get started. Before we get into the investigation, let's talk about Claire. She wasn't just a name in a case file. She was a real person with hopes and dreams, and her life was unfairly taken from her. Claire Jacqueline Josephs was just 20 years old. She lived in Bromley, England with her husband, Bernard. They were still newlyweds, and they were building their marriage, building their life together at their home at 15 Deep Dean Court on Kingswood Road. Claire was described as kind-hearted, vibrant, and full of life. She was the type of person that people naturally gravitated toward. She was friendly, warm, and was always willing to lend a hand. Bernard later said that she was the light of my life, and those who knew her echoed that sentiment. Her daily life was typical of a young woman in the 1960s, and on that particular day, February 7th, she had been preparing a meal, waiting for her husband to get home from work, completely unaware that her life was about to take a tragic turn. What makes her case even more heartbreaking and difficult to comprehend is that there were no warning signs. She wasn't having conflicts with anybody. There were no ongoing threats or anything like that. And yet, in a matter of moments, everything changed. On the evening of February 7th, 1968, Bernard came home from work expecting to be greeted by his wife. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. When he opened the door, the house felt eerily off. The kitchen light was on, and ingredients were out as if Claire had been in the middle of cooking. There was also a half-empty cup of coffee on the table, but Claire wasn't there. As Bernard moved through the house, dread began to set in. And then, in their bedroom, he found her. Claire's body was under the bed. Her throat was slashed so deeply that the wound reached her spine. The scene showed clear signs of a struggle. The defensive wounds on her hands told investigators that she had fought desperately for her life. But there were no signs of forced entry, which to detectives meant one thing: Claire had likely known her killer. She had let this person into her home willingly, and that realization sent a chill through investigators. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was someone that Claire trusted. The Kent County Constabulary quickly took over the case. Since there were no signs of a break-in, detectives started with the most obvious question: who had been in Claire's home? Bernard was, of course, their first subject. Everybody knows that you have to look at the spouse first in cases like this. But his alibi was solid. He had been at work all day with plenty of witnesses to back him up. So detectives turned their attention to other people in Claire's life. Who else had access to the house? Who might she have trusted enough to have let in? One name immediately stood out: Roger Payne. Payne was a 33-year-old man who lived nearby. He had done odd jobs for the Josephs before, so Claire would have recognized him and likely would have felt fine letting him in. But, he wasn't the only person who had ever been in the Josephs' home. So what put him on police's radar so quickly? His past. Payne had a criminal record, including violent assaults on women. That, combined with his connection to Claire, put him right at the top of the suspect list. Detectives brought Payne in for questioning, and right away they noticed something suspicious. His hands had scratches on them. When police asked him about them, he claimed that they were from a fight with his wife. But his alibi for the time of Claire's murder was flimsy, and the more investigators looked into him, the more things just didn't add up. And this is where the forensic science came in. Remember, this was 1968, so we're decades before DNA testing is a thing in criminal investigations. But investigators still had some tools at their disposal. Claire had been wearing a cerise-colored woolen dress at the time of her death. Payne had tried to cover his tracks by washing his clothes, but forensic experts knew better. They examined the seams and hems of his clothing under a microscope. And what did they find? Over 60 tiny fibers that matched Claire's dress. But that wasn't all. Investigators also searched Payne's car and found traces of blood that matched Claire's rare blood type. Now, at the time, forensic fiber analysis was still relatively new, and the idea of matching fibers from a victim's clothing to a suspect's was pretty groundbreaking. This case proved just how powerful even the smallest pieces of evidence could be. With this overwhelming evidence, Roger Payne was arrested and charged with Claire's murder. The trial took place in May 1968 at the Old Bailey in London, and it drew a lot of attention. Not just because of the horrific nature of the crime, but because of how forensic science was being used to solve it. The prosecution, of course, leaned heavily on that forensic evidence. They brought in experts to explain how fibers transferred during physical contact and why Payne's attempts to clean his clothes didn't erase all of the traces. The defense tried to argue that the fiber evidence was coincidental, but they had a harder time getting around the blood that was found in Payne's car. In the end, it took the jury only a few hours to reach a verdict. Payne was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. This case was a game changer for forensic science. It showed the world that fibers, blood evidence, and meticulous forensic work could be just as powerful as eyewitness testimony. Margaret Pereira, one of the forensic scientists on the case, later said, quote, "We proved that even the smallest traces can tell the truth," end quote. This case paved the way for future forensic breakthroughs. It proved that even when there are no witnesses, no confessions, and no obvious suspects, science can uncover the truth. Roger Payne went to prison, but that isn't where this story ends. In a shocking twist, Payne actually escaped from Leyhill Prison in 1991 after being turned down for parole for the 8th time. He was able to not only escape, but set up an entirely new life in the Gloucestershire town of Lindney under the name of Thomas Fairfax. He lived there for 3 years as a quiet, law-abiding, well-liked citizen until police came calling. Payne was rearrested and sent back to prison, and as of 2020, he had finally given up on being granted parole, though he has maintained his innocence in this case since 1968. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. In the meantime, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!